to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got a packed program for you today. In just a little bit, our South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez is going to be leading a conversation as we continue our coverage on the McAllen family that was detained by ICE and released just a few days ago. We're going to be speaking with senior fellow at the American Immigration Council, Reichlin-Melnick, who we've had on the program before and is always just a treasure trove of information. So we're looking forward to speaking with him in just a little bit. And our El Paso correspondent, Julian Resendiz, is going to join us to talk about a little bit about as we get ready to see what happens as the U.S. and Mexico begins formal talks on Monday to lay the groundwork for a mandatory 6-year review of the USMCA. So we'll get to him in just a little bit. But we first begin today with some new details released this morning about plans to build a $300 billion refinery right here on the U.S.-Mexico border. The America First project, as it's being referred to, would be the first refinery built in the United States in half a century. This morning, the Port of Brownsville, which is on the southernmost tip of Texas, said once built, the refinery will have 500 permanent jobs and bring thousands of indirect jobs in construction and other fields as they build up the facility. Port officials say the refinery will be built on 240 acres away from any residential areas. Brownsville Navigation District Chairman Esteban Steve Guerra says it could take up to 7 years to complete construction of the facility. Local environmentalists say South Texas, however, doesn't need an oil refinery.
We are expecting a state-of-the-art facility. I think it's also important to get that mental picture of smokestacks and smoke everywhere out of our minds. This is you got to remember, it's been 50 years. And in 50 years since the last refinery was built in the United States. So things are really different now.
The Brownsville community does not need this oil refinery. This oil refinery will release toxic pollution into our air, into our waterways. We urge all public officials here in South Texas to distance themselves away from this oil refinery that's just Trump's pet project.
Now, officials at the Port of Brownsville say we'll host town hall meetings and other outreach events to the community to try to lessen environmental concerns. Guerra also said that the port has the water and infrastructure to support this project, something that's been a rising question just up the road in Corpus Christi, Texas. Now, groundbreaking of the refinery should start in April, according to Guerra. The facility will be 10 miles away from the SpaceX launch sites here in South Texas and about 5 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. I did want to bring in our South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez for a moment because she's also been gathering reaction on this announcement that came really during the newscasts last night.
Right.
Came as a little bit of a shock to not just, folks living here, but some of the local officials as well.
Quite a surprise, an announcement around 5 o'clock by the White House last night that this was a done deal, basically. I did speak to environmentalists today. They had tremendous concerns about this. Jim Chapman of Friends of the Wildlife said it could be a blight on our community. I mean, arguably, South Padre Island is the most gorgeous beach, most pristine beach. It's not just an opinion. It's documented here in the entire state of Texas and on the Gulf. And this port is just miles from it. But some of the other concerns include the fact that this is supposed to be hydrogen powered. And apparently there has never been an oil refinery online that's hydrogen powered. So is that technology up to speed? Is it proven? Is it environmentally safe? They have, I was told, for every one question, they have probably 100 things that they don't know, more questions to ask. They said, this has been in the works. It was a dozen years ago that the request was put in for this refinery to be made. And then it was dropped. Immediately they had been concerned, and then it was dropped. And so they kind of lost their steam behind this, thinking this was not going to happen. And in the interceding years, one of the executive directors of the port actually told Jim the only thing he never wanted happen at the port was an oil refinery because it's such dirty energy. And so, the other thing is the question of the cost. It's $300 billion, but the current LNG port, which is massive there, is only $15 billion. So, this is, where's that number coming from, or is that related to this futuristic hydrogen fuel? Basically so many questions and concerns because, as you mentioned, this is right by SpaceX and this is right by the LNG refinery as well.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. As someone who's been covering SpaceX for 8 years, I've been to every single launch that SpaceX has done since it was, just a little, as I like to call it, a one-fan trash can to the super heavy Starship that they've been launching over recent years. And I think the question that I have is, it's about 10 miles away as the crow flies from that SpaceX launch facility, but it's the same question that people had when LNG was talking about building up their facility here. And what happens if a Starship explosion, one which we just saw around 7 months ago, and that was just a test on the ground. We've seen explosions happen just a few thousand
and we've
feet
had
in the air.
wildfires from the explosions that have caught the adjacent lands. As you mentioned, this is very, very close. This will be very, very close. What happens? That has always been a major concern of the environmentalists. And what would be released in the air if something like that was to happen? Yeah.
We'll see what happens, but we will stay on top of this, and we'll be asking those questions too to local officials. I do want to point out that people were asking safety questions this morning at that press conference with Port of Brownsville officials. One of them being are they going to have to hire more firefighters? Are they going to have to increase their agreement with municipalities like the city of Brownsville? Will the city of Starbase have to get more training?
And who will permit this?
Yeah.
Exactly, state and federal permits. Yeah, we actually plan on doing a show on this next week.
Yeah, so we'll keep you updated on that and hopefully get some answers to some of those questions for those of you at home. Thanks so much, Sandra. We'll see you again in just a little bit here. The United States and Mexico will begin formal talks on Monday to lay the groundwork for a mandatory 6-year review of a joint trade agreement. The bilateral talks are ahead of a scheduled review later this year of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, or the USMCA. Now, the USMCA has allowed Mexico to avoid much of Trump's protectionist measures because many Mexican goods are covered by that free trade agreement. But a number of products are not covered. So what's going to happen on Monday? Let's get over to the man that's been covering that for us, our El Paso correspondent, Julian Resendiz. Julian?
Rudy, good to be back. I can tell you that there were massive concerns about the future of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement over here on the border, on both sides of the border. I know that President Trump about a month ago spoke to people on the possibility of not renewing the treaty, saying that it was maybe not a good treaty, it was a bad treaty. And then there was further talk that maybe he wanted to have an individual treaty with Mexico and another treaty with Canada. Well, late last week, we got some breaking developments, and that is that the Mexican foreign minister, a guy who's very well known in the U.S., his name is Marcelo Ebrard, he traveled overnight to Washington, D.C., and to meet with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. And this is what he had to say.
Buenas tardes, para informarles.
I would like to inform you we have reached an agreement with my counterpart in the United States, Jamieson Greer, who heads the U.S. Trade Representative's office, to begin starting on March 16th, a first bilateral round of formal communication regarding the review of the trade agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. We will be talking about rules of origin, how we can increase production and integration of our economies to be more competitive with other regions of the world. We will also be talking about securing supply chains. We will continue to keep you informed, but it is important by instruction of President Sheinbaum to inform you about this first round of formal conversations beginning on March 16th.
So what I heard last week on the Mexican side was a big sigh of relief. Sigh of relief that they likely will not be losing any of the tax benefits that this treaty entails. Pretty much anything that is built in Mexico, Canada, or the U.S. can move about without tariffs for the most part, depending on the content of the parts. And that's one of the concerns that the U.S. has. They are concerned about Chinese encroachment in Mexico and about some of the Chinese products or raw materials, more likely, getting into content that is used in the manufacturing processes covered by the treaty. The U.S. says that is not fair, and that's one of the things that they want to clarify with Mexico in the coming round of talks. Now, this announcement on Thursday was followed by some concern that Canada was not included. However, a day later, I learned that the Canadian Trade Representative, Mr. LeBlanc, was also in Washington, and he actually put out a statement saying, "Yes, I was in Washington. I met with the U.S. Trade Representative's office, and we're going to proceed forward with talks." That's all he said, but that's also very encouraging. And over here, I heard from multiple people involved in the manufacturing industry, in the maquilas in Juarez, as well as in the industrial parks in El Paso and in southern New Mexico, which is right across the state line from El Paso. They are saying this is great. We don't know what the final review or the new renegotiated uh, points of the agreement are going to look like, but it's a good first step. Now, they were also concerned about Canada perhaps being excluded. Why? Because here in the maquiladoras, in Juarez and other places along the Mexican border, there are Canadian companies operating and enjoying the tariff and tax benefits of the USMCA treaty. We have an ATV vehicle manufacturer across the border in Juarez, and across the state line in New Mexico, we have a company from Canada that manufactures components for electrical vehicles. So, talking to the industrial leaders, they are very hopeful that this is going to move forward. What's going to happen on Monday? Let's say that these are the pre-talks to the formal negotiations. But from what Mr. Ebrard, the finance minister of Mexico, said, the groundwork has already been laid out. They know what the U.S. concerns are, and they're willing to talk about them.
And that's certainly good news. I mean, just to kind of give people an idea of how important this is, we were just talking about that multi-billion-dollar investment, that oil refinery opening up here at the Port of Brownsville in South Texas. That's part of the foreign trade zone, the economic zone, and they get certain benefits from that. So those benefits are only good when agreements like this come together and stay together. So, you know, just to kind of tie that in with a nice little bow on top to explain to folks how important this agreement is come Monday.
Exactly. Like I said, there's a big sigh of relief on both sides of the border, and hopefully this review can proceed.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Julian. Appreciate you joining us today. El Paso correspondent Julian Resendiz joining us to talk about the formal talks that are going to start Monday on that USMCA renegotiation. All right. Well, stay with us because when we come back, Sandra Sanchez is going to lead a conversation with Reichlin-Melnick of the American Immigration Council as we continue our coverage on the McAllen, Texas family that was detained by ICE and released earlier this week. Stay with us. We'll Report Live is back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. Going to bring Sandra Sanchez, our South Texas correspondent, back in. And our guest for today's program, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council, Reichlin-Melnick. Thanks so much for coming on again, Aaron.
Thank you for having me back.
We love talking to you, Aaron. One of the reasons we're bringing you in is this is our third day of coverage regarding the McAllen High School mariachi band member and his family who were arrested on February 25th, detained by ICE. And this teen, who is 18 years old, was actually held separately in Raymondville, here, near where we are here in Harlingen. You know, ICE issued a statement about the family's arrest and detention, and they said, quote, "The family unit illegally entered the U.S. in 2023 near Brownsville and were released into the country by the Biden administration. The law requires illegal aliens who show up at a port of entry without valid entry to be detained while all their claims are heard." You can look it up in the statute. Unlike the previous administration, the Trump administration is not going to ignore the rule of law. But at the time, the family came through the CBP One app, which I believe was the rule of law. So were they, did they illegally enter the country, and how has this rule changed, Aaron?
Yeah, the short answer is no, they did not illegally enter the country. The CBP One app process was a system set up by the Biden administration in 2023 to standardize the process for people to go to ports of entry and seek asylum. You know, even in President Trump's first term, his DHS secretaries told migrants, if you want to seek asylum, you should go to a port of entry rather than cross the border illegally. But that led to issues with thousands of people waiting physically in line or on lists kept in, you know, notebooks on the Mexican side of the border so that they were waiting for their turn. The Biden administration decided to standardize it with an appointment system set up through this CBP One app. which let people essentially pre-enter their information, share their face for facial recognition screening, and allow the government to do some early vetting before they ever got to the port of entry. And then once they arrived for their appointment, they were paroled into the United States, a lawful means of entering the country, giving them permission to be here. So the idea that someone who came through the CBP-1 process entered illegally is just not true.
And since you know, as you mentioned, during the CBP-1 app, people actually waited for months, sometimes even years, south of the border to get these much coveted appointments. I believe there were only like 250 appointments a day at 9 ports of entry. We were tracking them over that period. So it was almost like winning the lottery at that time. So if indeed the Gomez-Cuellar family, you know, got a CBP-1 app appointment, they waited for it, this was a lucky break. And as you mentioned, they crossed legally.
That's right. The CBP-1 process always had more demand than supply. There were a lot of people who wanted to do what the government asked of them, which is to come legally. And the Biden administration actually created a whole carrot and stick process where people who chose not to use the CBP-1 app were punished and actually had a harder time seeking asylum than people who came to the ports of entry through the CBP-1 app. And it was essentially a weighted lottery. People who applied had earliest had the lowest chance of winning. The longer you waited, the higher your chances of winning on any given day. But there were some people that means that ended up waiting months and months in Mexico, all because they wanted to come legally. They wanted the U.S. government to be able to say this person didn't break the law. And that's why it's so disheartening to see people who chose to do everything by the books, by the way the government was telling them to, now be accused of illegally entering the country when the government's own records show that's not true.
And for ICE officials to tell the media that they illegally entered the country. And that's kind of, we wanted this on the record to clarify that we know, because we've covered this for years, that that was the legal pathway at the time. Now, CBP-1 app has been dissolved, and instead it is the CBP Home app, correct, where they can self-deport?
Yeah, that's right. You know, the Biden administration's program was always controversial. Trump administration officials, even before they took office, claimed that it was an abuse of the president's powers to extend humanitarian parole. But even if they were right and the Biden administration exceeded its authority, that doesn't mean that the people who took advantage of the program, who came in through the ports of entry, did anything wrong. The program was on the books. It was officially passed as a federal regulation. Texas actually sued to overturn it. That lawsuit was dismissed in court on procedural grounds. And so it was a lawful means of entry, even if you think that the program itself may have, you know, exceeded the rules. That said, when Trump took office, he got rid of the program immediately and replaced the app with CBP Home, which is a way now that people can supposedly report for self-deportation and potentially receive some form of cash benefit if they can prove that they have gone through that system and left the country.
And since you mentioned legal pathways at the time, what are the legal pathways now that asylum seekers, refugees can take if they want to try to enter the United States?
Well, today it's effectively impossible to seek asylum at the southern border. Migrants cannot go to ports of entry to seek asylum. Even the limited ways in which they were processing people in at ports of entry in Trump's first term have been cut off. And those who cross the border illegally between ports of entry are almost universally being turned away, although some few are still able to seek asylum in immigration court, but at very, very low chances of success. Right now, effectively, the only people who are able to seek asylum in the United States are those who have visas, who can enter the country legally and then apply for asylum after they arrive here. And of course, the Trump administration has effectively eliminated the U.S. refugee resettlement program, which people apply for while outside the United States, and said that it should only be for white South Afrikaners.
Right. That leads me to another question. There was a Department of Justice report that came out last month that showed in the first quarter there were 21,000 in absentia removal orders issued. That's up from about 50,100 in all of 2025. So what is happening? Are asylees not showing up for their court hearings? Is this because there is no legal pathway for them to continue to be in the United States? What is your take on this data?
The first thing to note is that studies have consistently shown that people show up for their immigration court hearings. This has always been true. As much as the Trump administration in his first term claimed that the majority of migrants crossing the border, disappeared and never showed up for their court hearings, government data has always shown that not to be true. Around 75 to 85% of all people who are in immigration court will appear for every single court hearing. And if they have lawyers, that rate rises to above 95%. But what we are seeing in recent months is a disturbing trend. Last year, the Trump administration began arresting people who were showing up for their court hearings and throwing them in detention before their cases had concluded in an effort to essentially push them through the removal process far quicker than had they been outside of detention. And ever since that started happening, more people have been failing to appear in court because they're worried that if they do what the government told them to do and appear for their court hearing, they will end up shackled, taken to an ICE detention center, and jailed potentially for weeks or months while they go through the rest of the court process. And this is essentially a broken promise. The government had always said, if you show up for your court hearings, if you follow the rules and comply, you are not going to be thrown in detention unless you did something wrong. But of the Trump administration's push for higher arrest numbers and higher deportations, that has led to people now being afraid of showing up for their court hearing. And yes, there has been an increase in people choosing not to appear out of fear.
Makes sense. It's ironic that the Gomez-Cuellar family, however, were all told, even with their 3 children, while it was a school day, to appear that day for the ICE meeting, and then they were all arrested. And the 18-year-old was separated and held in a different detention facility, and the other 4 were taken to a family facility. So they were among the brave who showed up and faced these consequences. You're saying many people are not because they're scared.
Yes, and I think, what happened in this situation is a good example of, the fear that a lot of people going through this process have. There's still over 3 million people in immigration court proceedings, and a lot of them want to follow the rules. They've showed up to all of their ICE check-ins. They've gone to all of their court hearings. They are diligently following every rule the government places on them because they're afraid that if they don't, they'll end up detained. And some of these people will end up eventually winning relief and being allowed to stay in the country, but many of them will end up eventually being ordered deported. And so the government, the Trump administration, which really wants to ramp up these arrest and deportation numbers, has discovered that the easiest way to do that is to go after this essentially compliant population of people, those who are willing to show up when asked by ICE. Those who are already on the government's radar. In fact, they're already in a deportation process while they're waiting to seek asylum. And now, because the government is going after them, it is in some ways actually leading to less compliance because people are afraid of what happens if they do what the government says.
It makes sense. Yesterday, the White House Chief of Staff spoke to Republican lawmakers at a GOP retreat in Florida and urged them to discuss mass deportation. And White House officials said, we are not, told the Washington Post, nobody is changing the administration's immigration enforcement agenda. So it doesn't sound like the Trump administration is going to change their policy anytime soon.
Certainly when it comes to this particular policy, we've seen no indication that they're pulling back on it. Because again, these are the easiest ways the government has to ramp up arrests, is go after those people who are willing to show up when asked. In other words, being the most compliant with immigration officials can now put you in the most risk, which is really perverse. It puts people between a rock and a hard place. They want to follow the rules, especially people like this who entered legally and who have never done anything wrong and have at all times done what the government asked them to do, now find themselves faced with a really difficult choice when they get called in for these check-ins. Do we go in risking the possibility that this time I'm going to be let out in handcuffs? Or do you choose for the very first time not to comply and then risk that you'll be pulled over at work or in your home and let out in handcuffs.
Wow.
We've been speaking with Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we appreciate you joining us once again, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks so much.
All right, stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. Welcome back. Just wanted to remind you before we leave, you can stay informed on the story shaping the U.S.-Mexico border in podcast form. We're bringing you real-time updates, expert insights, and voices from both sides of the border at those apps on your screen. For Julian Resendiz in El Paso, Sandra Sanchez right here in South Texas, my name is Rudy Mireles. We'll see you next time.